So this morning we moved Nina Möntmann and Emily Roysden to the first session, and this afternoon it's now Louis Jacob, and in place of Carlos Basualdo, who sadly isn't able to join us, as we discovered yesterday, my colleague Jon Davies has very, I think bravely, agreed to present a paper that he had written for a recent conference about the work of Colin Campbell, which ties in very suggestively to many of today's themes. So we'll begin with Louis' presentation, and then we'll have John, and then we'll have some time for discussion. So Louis Jacob, somebody asked my director Gregory Burke recently, does Louis have a residency at the power plant? Because we can't seem to get enough of Louis. We included him, Greg and I included him in a group exhibition that we organized here just over 2 years ago called We Can Do This Now, which highlighted Toronto-based artists. Nina Möntmann, completely unprompted by us, selected him for the current exhibition, If We Can't Get It Together. And as well as being a very interesting visual artist, Louis is also a great writer, so we have a terrific piece by him in our in our new magazine called Switch. And if you haven't read it yet, I urge you. It's a wonderful artist statement about how sort of histories, collective histories, aesthetic histories sustain his practice. And now, of course, we have Louis speaking today because we also find him to be a very evocative and thoughtful presenter. So Louis was born in Lima in Peru and has been living in Toronto since his teens. He's an artist. He's also curated. He's also an educator and, as I mentioned, a writer. He uses diverse media to trace the history of modernism, gesture, and communication in works that often trace the philosophical and cultural possibilities of social interactions. So I think those phrases alone, we've been talking about a number of these ideas: communication, gesture, aesthetic histories. So clearly there's lots to be going on. Jacob has participated in Documenta 12 last year, in La Biennale de Montreal also last year, and has had solo exhibitions recently at the Kunstverein in Hamburg last year, and in 2007 at the Morris and Helen Belkin Art Gallery in Vancouver. And as I mentioned, his work is featured in the current exhibition. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce and welcome Louis Jacob.
I'm going to sit down. Thanks, Helena. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited to be part of this, and the presentation last night and the two presentations this morning are really exciting and stimulating for me. So I'm very grateful to be a part of this. The premise of my talk is the idea that historical continuity is the Achilles heel of Toronto art making. More precisely, the absence in this city of a sense of historical continuity renders the act of making art into a poignant but self-defeating gesture. And permit me to ask a couple of rhetorical questions. When was the last time you found a piece of writing dealing with the relationship between current production in the city and what has gone on before it? When was the last time you were able to attend a retrospective on the work of a Toronto artist? If we agree that artistic production is a communicative practice, a practice in which the meaning of community becomes an issue, then a lack of historical context amounts to something like a lack of language, which is to say that artistic production would somehow have to exist without publicness. Exhibition would follow exhibition, artist would follow artist, decade would follow decade, and quickly each of these would sink into our collective amnesia, into the black hole of cultural disregard. one must ask what the situation would mean for artists, how an artist, especially a young one, would envision being an artist in the face of this radical atomization, without a public, without a language, and without a future. Making art is defeated in advance if artists are unable to create or even to imagine their own ideal audience and the world for which their work is created. Now, I'm not complaining, mind you. This lack of historical continuity has fundamentally shaped who I am and the work I do as an artist, as curator, as writer, and as teacher. I honestly cannot imagine working in a different context. And of course, recent initiatives, Barbara Fisher's touring General Idea Editions exhibition, Jon Davies' retrospective of the work of Colin Campbell, and Philip Monk's ongoing series of restaged Toronto exhibitions, beginning with his Fastworms exhibition, suggest that the situation I'm describing might well be in the process of transformation. Nevertheless, in the absence of history, people turn to myth. In the absence of history, we begin to gossip. I'm borrowing Jon Davies' term. In the absence of history, we begin to enact what Robert Filieu called a whispered art history. So something to whisper. More than 20 years ago, A. Bronson from the artist group General Idea curated an exhibition right here at the power plant called From Sea to Shining Sea, Artist-Initiated Activity in Canada, 1939 to 1987. The exhibition and accompanying publication functioned as a kind of manifesto about what artistic culture can mean here in Canada. He posited that a series of independent initiatives begun in the late 1930s had culminated in the 70s in a coast-to-coast network of self-organized galleries and publications that had created a viable culture that stood in sharp contrast to the staid museums and commercial galleries that dominated the Canadian art world. Bronson's vision of culture, as presented in From Sea to Shining Sea, was essentially a network one. That is, culture appeared to be based less on individual figures or institutions than on what arises when one connects the dots between these individualities. He wrote in his catalog text, "As an artist, writing about museums by artists, about my own history, which is a history beginning in 1968, a Canadian story with elaborately Canadian characters, dreaming the Canadian dream of one community that is a network of communities, sea to sea." What is striking to me in Bronson's description is its tentative tone, its characterization of the cultural network as a kind of dream. He continues, "As a Canadian artist, then, wanting a Canadian art scene just like in New York or London or Paris in the 30s. As a Canadian artist typically unable to picture the reality of a Canadian art scene, except as a dream projected upon the national landscape as a sea to shining sea connective tissue. For Bronson, the Canadian dream of one community that is a network of communities appears here as something lacking, as an absence, and therefore as something to desire, and to project upon the landscape around us." And he continues to describe this community. "A dream community connected by and reflected by the media, that is authenticated by its own reflection in the media. As such a Canadian artist desiring to see not necessarily himself, but the picture of his art scene as pictured on TV. And knowing the impossibility of an art scene without real museums. The Art Gallery of Ontario was not a real museum for us. Without real magazines, and Arts Canada was not a real magazine for us. Without real artists, no, Harold Town was not a real artist for us. And we forgot that we ourselves were real artists, because we had not seen ourselves in the media. Real artists, like Frank Stella, appeared in Art Forum magazine." Here it's worth wondering what Bronson means when he writes about the media. The tendency today is to make media synonymous with new mass communication technologies like television, video, and the internet. And certainly Bronson points us in this direction when he describes the myth of the Canadian artist desiring to see the picture of his art scene as pictured on TV. Undeniably, the artists of Bronson's generation, especially those connected with the intermedia scene in Vancouver in the late 1960s, were informed by Marshall McLuhan's important theories on the effects of new media upon consciousness, culture, and social formations. When Bronson refers to media, however, he is pointing to something broader than simply new media. Media is rather anything that stands between as a mediating channel. For Bronson, the media is a means of fabricating a tissue. This insight, the notion that media is whatever stands between, emerged from Bronson's participation in the Vancouver art scene of the early 1970s, and that scene's fascinating merging together of McLuhan's media theory on the one hand with the Fluxus ideas of Robert Filieu and George Brecht on the other. Filieu's idea of the eternal network has come to refer to the international network of artists who, for many decades now, continue to produce and exchange artistic activity using the postal system. Mail art, or correspondence art, creates an eternal network to the extent that these artists utilize an already existing channel of communication, the mail, as a ready-made conduit for fabricating a tissue. Esther Millman describes it in this way. The primary defining characteristic of all correspondence art networks is that they are communication cultures. In their pure transitive state, outside the museum, gallery, and alternative space system, correspondence works are overtly transactional. They serve as a means by which community is established and through which members of a culture interact. This is a piece by Michael Morris called Nothing by Mouth from 1971. This project was produced as a contribution to Dana Atchley's correspondence project, Space Atlas. In Morris's words, Dana invited people that he knew around his network to send him 100 self-made pages. He assembled all these things, packaged it, and sent a copy out to people who had participated, 100 copies for 100 people. And of course, this should remind us, I think, of projects like LTTR, although in this specific case of Space Atlas, the audience is strictly defined by its participants. So 100 copies were made for 100 people. It was all sent out, and everybody saw what each other was doing. Our image bank pages were perforated postcards on a page, postcards that could be used. They were invitations to send original postcards for our image bank postcard show, which was in 1971. Those pages were building image bank. Now, this is an exemplary instance of how the network works, of the connect the dots impulse that Millman described as the network's overtly transactional methodology. Dana Atchley's original invitation resulted in the creation and submission of 100 artistic responses, which returned, this time collected together, back to the artists who had replied. Each of these replies, in principle, can act as yet more invitations to further participation, creating a decentered network of creative activity. What is interesting to me about this work is Morris's idea of mediation. Nothing by mouth, as the postcard says, suggests that the network method entails a move away from the immediacy of the mouth, the proximity and intimacy of mouth-to-mouth communication, and the immanent relationality that it engenders. This move away from immediacy is simultaneously a move towards the mediatedness of the media. This media could involve the new media of Ankawara's telegrams or anything company's faxes, for example, but it could equally utilize the old media of the postal system. When A.A. Bronson writes about the dream of one community that is a network of communities, he is indicating to us the always tentative or propositional possibility of a community created by mediation rather than by immediacy. The defining quality of McLuhan's global village is precisely that it is not a village. For an artist, however, mediation presents an intractable dilemma. For an artist who works in a community that is a network of communities, and a village that cannot possibly be a village because it is global, the question of here becomes tricky terrain indeed. I might well correspond with artists as far away as Santiago, Berlin, Shanghai, and I might read art forum with the avidity of a celebrity hound. I might feel totally up to date with art world developments in the biennial circuit and have done the grand tour. But how do I relate to the people next to me, right here in this place we call Toronto? The question of place, of here, is precisely the question of audience and peership, of the oral being together of proximity and immediacy. What is the relationship between culture by mouth and culture by media? General Idea's answer to this question is typically ambivalent and perhaps defeatist, and is colored by the poignancy that profoundly belongs to irony. In their performance Towards an Audience Vocabulary of 1978, General Idea rehearsed their local audience in the various appropriate audience responses characteristic of a real audience. Fern Bayer describes the performance. General Idea used the television-style studio format in which 36 local Toronto celebrities were placed on stage in the concert hall of the Masonic Temple, performing the various audience responses, wearing the censor sunglasses, laughing, gasping, booing, sleeping, clapping, and standing ovations. It left the real audience confused about their own role and conscious of that fact. Eventually, at the end, the real audience gave their standing ovation to the performer's own standing ovation. General Idea can dream the audience, but it does so only on condition that it dreams of an inorganic audience. That is, an audience that emerges not spontaneously, not naturally from its own culture, but artificially, theatrically, out of its own lack of artistic culture. The audience is made to undergo a mediatization of itself. An artifice is introduced so that it stands between the audience, splitting it in two. A factical audience, that is the people who attended the performance, and a performing audience. The performing audience reflects the factical audience, but it does so not to reveal the audience as it is, but as it is not. In order to construct a vocabulary, the factical audience is rehearsed into what it is being dreamed of becoming, a real audience. And here we might recall Bronson's words about there being no real museums, no real magazines, and no real artists in Canada when General Idea began their work. And their work as a whole can in fact be seen as a vast rehearsal for what a real museum would look like, what a real magazine would look like, and what real artists would look like here in Canada. And I want to add that the performing audience that we see, the group of 36 local Toronto celebrities, are of course celebrities only in a most qualified sense. This celebrity group is composed of significant Toronto figures, well-known, in fact crucial people, but only within the borders of a small circle. And in some of these images, maybe we can spot artist David Buchan, musicians Carol Pope and Kevin Staples of Rough Trade, and video curator Peggy Gale among this group of celebrities. According to Fluxus artist Ken Friedman, When Robert Fillieu developed his concept of the eternal network, he was thinking of the human condition rather than art. Fillieu held that the purpose of art was to make life more important than art. That was the central idea of the eternal network. But any discussion of the eternal network of correspondence art must be a discussion of art to some degree. It is worth investigating the differences in key issues. The eternal network posited interesting oppositions to prevailing art world ideology. The art world placed great stress on individual performance, on the notion of the master, on creating masterworks or masterpieces. The eternal network placed its stress on dialogue, even on the multilogue, the process of group research and the community of discourse. So for Friedman, if art is the realm of individuality and mastery, of creativity embodied in objects, masterpieces, the network is the place for dialogue, for what that wonderful concept, the multilogue, suggests, and for creativity embodied in process, the process of group research and the community of discourse. The intriguing thing is that these two realms, artwork and network, are not separate from or external to one another, but rather each exists in a strange dialectical relationship with the other. Art, with all its inherited baggage about mastery and individuality, is perhaps for that very reason a signal place where we ask the question of what hovers above art as the connective tissue of transactional activity and the eternal community of discourse and networked exchange. And the network, with all its desire for a radically horizontal and dynamic immanence without leaders or followers, must perhaps unwillingly, and yet no less necessarily, return to art as its reified and abstracted, yet gleaming or shining towards the future, place of rest. The network's energies, its fluxes, its flows, its sea-to-sea activities in a state of pure transitiveness, come to sleep in the realm of art and assume an inert objectivity that flirts with mimicking death. Art is the kitsch form of these energies, their degraded and emptied form. And yet, precisely as art, as abstract ready-mades, they can make themselves available in the future to reactivation, can melt into stream-like transactionality once again. Even as kitsch, as high art, in other words, works of art are the artifice, the theatricality, the media, pure and simple, where creative energies are split into those that live and those that are embalmed, into those that flow and those that do not. Art functions as a kind of weather vane that orients us to what is dead or dormant and what still lives. This orientation is possibly an inverted one, where it is not obvious that high is better than low, or that group is worse than the select. In crucial ways, the aesthetics of general idea emerged from a network ethos. And even until the end of their 25-year-long career, in their work, they continued to pay homage to the process of group research and the community of discourse, the network community that they had early encountered in Toronto, as well as in Winnipeg and Vancouver. And yet, even in these early years, general idea was especially attuned to the dialectical play between the stresses of art, the struggle for recognition, for professional opportunities, for canonization into a history not whispered, and the stresses of network, the effort of collectivity, of transactional creation, of literally creating languages out of thin air. The contradictions between artwork and network, between the community of the mouth and the community of the medium, is the ground from which general ideas production emerged. The way in which they negotiated these demonic relationships instruct us about the genius of this artist whose 3 heads are better than one, as well as to the limits or horizons of their practice. Perhaps for spiritual reasons, because they foresaw the pitfalls within the network logic, its risk of becoming a closed system, a circle, a system whose values apply only within itself. And perhaps for not so spiritual reasons, because, as they claim provocatively, they wanted to be famous and glamorous and rich. General Idea recognized the artistic necessity of hierarchic forms of legitimacy, while remaining at some deep level committed to the network promise of a horizontal, stream-like, today we might say rhizomatic, transactionality. The queen selected from among the beauties, the swan that stands apart from the pigeons, the one who was deemed best able to personify the spirit of Miss General Idea 1971 was Michael Morris, Marcel Idea, who was declared ambivalently to have captured glamour without falling into it. This ambivalence is reiterated in the profoundly impossible notion of museums by artists. When A. Bronson describes himself as an artist writing about museums by artists, about my own history, he is trying to imagine an impossible figure who would be both historian and artist, archivist and artist, curator and artist at one and the same time. For General Idea, this impossible figure is exactly what the artist has always been called to become in this place we call Canada, at least since as far back as the 1930s. And we wonder if especially when reading the From Sea to Shining Sea catalog, one wonders if, in fact, there would be any archives at all, any history writing at all, any galleries or art magazines or production facilities or museums in Canada at all. The artist is a figure that embodies the impossibly necessary and necessarily impossible idea that the energies of network culture could survive intact in the form of the work of art. The idea that the creativity born of pure transitivity and anonymous flux could be preserved in the who's who genealogies of an artistic canon with all its inclusions and exclusions. And finally, that these energies, necessarily eternal and so without time, could be reconciled with history not whispered, but printed on paper and distributed on newsstands. For museums by artists to exist, art must imitate life. Art must mirror life, not in order to represent it, but rather to split it in two, one an inverted image of the other. For an artistic history to exist, the time of our life must become the emit of our file. For artists to be artists, we must remain poised uneasily between publicness and publicity. In the end, General Idea expresses a deep pessimism in the ability of the artistic public, and even of artists' own self-organized communities, to perform the thankless task of a whispered art history, and to fill the void of cultural disregard with their own golden emissions. Toronto will never have real artists if what has happened here always remains just a thing of the past. But history is never about the past. Rather, history is an activity of the present in which we make decisions about visibility itself. What energies from the past we are or are not relevant to us today? What aspects of the past will we give over to visibility? And what of its aspects we will relegate to invisibility, to obscurity? Visibility is in many ways the enemy. But art, by definition, is an act of visibility, of publicness. What it makes visible shines, as much as it casts a glare that throws other things into blindness. At the same time, art demands not that I follow my own inspiration, the unique trajectories of my artistic genius, but rather, art demands that I take up the words of another and speak them as my own. Art communicates, not because it conveys ideas from artist to audience, but because it is like a language, that is, an open invitation for ecstasy or self-transcendence, for joining in the network culture belonging to a tissue whose nodal points are original only if they are dead, whose connecting lines ever begin only if they have already come to an end. Thanks.
This chair's quite nice. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Jon Davies to you. Poor John. Not only is he doing all the travel, speakers arrangements, writing a lot of the copy, technical behind the scenes, but yesterday he was the person to receive the email from Carlos Basualdo saying he couldn't make it. And then we kind of buttonholed him and said, well, maybe you'd like to take his place. So John really is earning his keep at the power plant as assistant curator of public programs. And so when we did discover that Carlos couldn't make it, I called Louis, who was sharing the session with Carlos, and Louis said, well, John probably hasn't told you because John's very modest, but he gave a brilliant paper a weekend or so ago related to the Colin Campbell show that he curated for Oakville Galleries, and maybe the themes, resonate very well with today. So John agreed at the last minute to join us. So in addition to being assistant curator of public programs at the power plant, John's very active as a writer and as a curator. He's published in journals internationally and nationally and magazines, as well as in the anthologies, The Cinema of Todd Haynes, All That Heaven Allows, and the volume Cinematic Folds, The Furling and Unfurling of Images, which came out last year. John has also organized film and video programs and exhibitions for Toronto organizations such as Pleasure Dome, Gallery TPW, Cinematheque Ontario, and the Images Festival, and also for the Aurora Festival in Norwich in the UK. His exhibition, People Like Us, The Gossip of Colin Campbell, I think it's still on. Maybe today is the last day, or of February. Oh, good. So we have a whole more month to get out there. It's a very full show, so you need to give yourself quite a bit of time. And after that, it will travel throughout North America, and there will also be a catalogue. So, as I mentioned, this paper, which was not written for today, but which we think ties in very, very beautifully to today, is the focus of John's talk. Thanks so much, John.
So I'm going to start with a 9-minute video, and let's just see if this works.
I had just been to the Pick and Save to get some artificial ferns for the study. I was waiting for the light on the Lincoln Boulevard entrance to the Santa Monica Freeway. I looked in the rear view mirror and noticed this man in the car behind me, writing down something on a piece of paper. It gave me a funny feeling because I think he was copying down my license number. The light turned green and I got into the fast lane. A few minutes later, near the La Cienega exit, I heard a car honking persistently to my right. I looked over and it was the same man that I had noticed earlier. He was looking at me and only occasionally watching where he was going on the freeway. When he seemed satisfied that I had noticed him, he cut across the three lanes of traffic and got off at the next exit. This pain is so noisy. Valium. I am really hurt that you are doing this to me. So unfair. Do you see the poinsettias there in Barbara Streisand's hair? Behind her head. I think she looks so beautiful. The lights are hurting the insides of my eyes. Everyone is dressed in Snow White for the premiere. I don't understand why. The noise is hurting my eyes. Perhaps it is an avalanche. Oh, he is turning over now. Over now, so slowly. He is upside down now. It will hurt his head when it is crushed against the glacier. I can hear the ice crushing inside my head now. It is turning red with your blood. Poinsettia red. Why are you doing this to me? Wait, I need a minute. What is that you put in my eyes? So soft. Sticky. Oh, it's mine. Oh, no, please, not again. It hurts my eyes too much. The freeway smells burnt and soft. I think this is really unfair. I'm dead. The San Gabriel Mountains were visible all the way from Santa Monica this morning as I turned off the Pacific Coast Highway and headed east. The traffic wasn't too heavy. My window was down and the sun was very warm on my arm. I turned right onto the San Diego southbound. The San Diego freeway was much more crowded. It is always crowded. I was going to the new Fox Hills shopping mall. I edged over to the outside lane. Suddenly, he was very close to my right. Too close. I braked and was forced onto the shoulder. And he still came closer. And as I stopped, he pulled in front of me and stopped. I leapt out of the car and ran back to me. He has something in his hand. I look up at the sign beside the road. Culver City Limits. He shot me twice. I did not know him. The police have not been able to establish a motive. I was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital.
Hi, everyone. So for those of you who don't know, Colin Campbell was a pioneering Canadian video artist and an iconic figure in the Toronto art world who arguably laid the foundations of the very visible and vibrant queer art and media art scenes that we have in Toronto today. And the title of my catalog essay for the retrospective that I curated of his work was stolen from this videotape. Specifically, Colin, here in the video as the woman from Malibu, his haunting or her haunting comment about the man who shot her, "I did not know him." And when I use these words, "I did not know him," it became a confession. I did not have the chance to meet Colin Campbell before he passed away from cancer in 2001, but yet in a very real way, I've been able to get to know him through his work and through his loved ones over the past 16 months. And I'm just going to briefly read the sort of summary of the exhibition before I get to my talk. Pioneering Canadian artist Colin Campbell used video as a flexible and accessible medium for storytelling. His oeuvre is about characters and their words. Campbell's homespun tapes are a perverse collage of tall tales, rumors, conversations, and daydreams gleaned from his everyday life. Ever the great collector, Campbell would borrow a bon mot here, a dirty joke there, a dash of tabloid eccentricity, and voila, an unforgettable story and unforgettable character. Making art was no sublime act of creation, but merely what friends and lovers did together in the incestuous young art community developing in Toronto in the 70s and 80s. Ironic, irreverent, and ambiguous, always attuned to the playful shifting of genders and desires, Campbell's tapes chart how identities performed and circulated in the social world. Boundaries of truth and falsity concerned him even less than conventional ideas of screen acting and narrative closure did. For the most vibrant personas, those we remember and celebrate like his art star, the woman from Malibu, and Robin, are those that liberally supplement the banal details of lived experience with the excesses of myth and fantasy. Art historian Gavin Butt has suggested gossiping is a form of social activity which produces and maintains the affiliations of artistic community. Campbell's life and art practice derived both inspiration and form through gossip. The characters he created and inhabited, and those he coaxed out of his collaborators, confide secrets and stories to us, crafting elaborate and compelling mythologies around themselves. As Campbell absorbed all manner of talk from his acquaintances, friends, and lovers, he and his ragtag group of performer pals processed these day-to-day experiences through video and spat them back out again. This feedback loop opened up his art practice to those of his closest kin, among them John Grayson, Lisa Steele, George Hawken, Johanna Householder, Tanya Mars, Rodney Worden, Margaret Moores, and Almerinda Travassos, as well as to his many students and protégés, resulting in the engaged conversation between artists and artworks that goes into cohering and procreating an art scene. Gossip is the traffic in unofficial information, a form of makeshift knowledge about people in one's social world and what they get up to. It is not ultimately about whether something is actually true, based as it is on the whims of its participants rather than hard evidence. Campbell's tapes demonstrate how reality can be manipulated and made up to reflect one's desires. Through videotape, he gossiped with and about his real social circle and created a new one, a group of fictional personas who became tangibly real once their tapes were watched, loved or hated, and talked about. By the time Campbell passed away, his personas were left bereft of a body, but they continue to float freely in our collective consciousness to this day. So basically, I wanted the exhibition to resemble a room full of conversations between people that you would want to get to know better if you didn't know them already. I thought that Colin's friends and colleagues would be emotionally affected by seeing so many of him in one space 7 years after his passing. What I didn't expect was that when you looked around, the gallery's layout produced uncanny juxtapositions of his and the other faces on his tapes, with the flesh and blood faces that were in the room. Sometimes the same person's face could be glanced both on tape from 30 years ago and live as well. Also, people were not only moved by the presence of Colin and others who have passed away there in that room, but by the sight of themselves younger, not just from another time, but seemingly from another place. Writing about photography, Roland Barthes in Camera Lucida finds each image an irreversible reminder that whatever was recorded by the camera no longer exists as it had at that instant. With film and video, the scene might unfold in time, rather than be stuck in a single instant as in photography, but that span of time is still forever gone. All indexical recordings serve to remind us of what has already been lost, and as Susan Sontag, bless her soul, put it, all photographs are memento mori. Some of the stories I heard of people's reactions to the show that night reminded me of one of the key scenes of American artist Greg Bordowitz's 1994 video Fast Trip Long Drop, which powerfully confronted his own and the wider AIDS activist movement's feelings of demoralization at that point of the crisis. The scene is of his video activist colleague Giancarlo Musto speaking about the growing sadness of editing AIDS activist tapes, how so many of the participants are dead or dying, perhaps now only existing on tape. Despite the feisty activist rhetoric on display, each video had become for her, quote, a record of loss that starts to become almost a burden, difficult to watch. Because of that, it completely changed its meaning. The footage Bordowitz shows during this scene is of the day of desperation in 1991, basically a funeral march come demonstration. And I believe that's a screenshot. So populating the Colin Campbell exhibition, we have the ghost of Colin, as well as the ghosts of Tim Guest, David Buchan, Alex Wilson, Felix Parts, and many others who appeared in the videos. But separate from these real casualties of history, there are also the ghosts that Colin included as characters throughout his work. His tapes are certifiably haunted by ghosts, with several characters continuing to talk, to reveal secrets, and to spin yarns for us from beyond the grave. And it is particularly uncanny hearing a living Colin speak from the perspective of a dead person where now he is actually dead. So we have Carrie Quinter as Anouk, who is Anna's lover who is dying of cancer in Colin's masterpiece called Dangling by Their Mouths. While living, she recites a lengthy passage from the dead matriarch Addie Bundren's famed monologue in William Faulkner's novel As I Lay Dying, and the title is stolen from As I Lay Dying. Quinter, who chose the selection from the novel herself for the video, calls it, quote, the part where he, Faulkner, lets his dead woman speak. Then, like Addie Bundren, Anouk speaks from the dead herself at tape's end to offer an unsettling conclusion to the drama. Then we have Colin as the woman from Malibu in Culver City Limits, as we saw, where she devastatingly recounts her own murder on the highway. And it's not just one murder, but it's two, because we hear a sort of fantasy of what she's imagining awaits her from this stranger that's stalking her in the sort of middle section that's all black. And then we finally have the actual account of what happened at the end. And then we have Colin again as John in Conundrum Clinique, a vain cosmetic key nuclear scientist whose testimony is juxtaposed with that of Nancy, played by Anne Dean, looking gorgeous, his boss/lover at NASA, who killed him either accidentally or on purpose. It's left unclear. And then there's Andrea in Deadly Destiny, Colin's second of two unpublished novels written in 1998. And appropriately enough, she's a scholar of reincarnation narratives who disappears in Belgium before a conference and writes to her colleague and friend Mallory, the book's protagonist, to tell her how she had been kidnapped and murdered. So these voices from the dead, these ghosts, offer a moving foreshadowing of Colin's power to stay with us long after his passing, thanks to the proliferation of his body and soul into so many personas and into his intensely loved accomplices over 30 years of work. The gossip of Colin Campbell, his characters and what they said, the real social world they were drawn from, continue to transform the lives of those who saw them. And I want to invoke Louis' term, the eternal network here. I would like to propose that Colin's continued presence in Toronto, and specifically in our art scene and its generations of participants, is paradigmatic of a form of queer cultural transmission that transcends frail and fallible human bodies to pass on queer knowledge and feelings across time and space. And Emily Royston talked about this extensively in her talk. I just want to invoke some of her phrases. Reaching behind you and pulling something forward, intergenerational dialogue. So there's been a great amount of attention paid of late in academia to the idea of queer temporality, to how we can imagine different forms of experiencing time than the forward-moving rush of progress or the familiar life narrative of birth, childhood, adulthood, marriage, reproduction, and death. Queer theorist Elizabeth Freeman has commented on how queers are often constructed as without past or future. On the one hand, quote, no childhood, no origin or precedent in nature, no family traditions or legends, and crucially, no history as a distinct people. On the other hand, quote, no children, no succeeding generations, no meaningful way to contribute to society, no hope, no plans, and nothing to offer most political tomorrows. The result is that the past haunts many queer cultural producers like a specter. History compels us. Carla Frequeira speaks of, quote, a desire issuing from another time and placing a demand on the present in the form of an ethical imperative. In a roundtable on queer temporality in the journal GLQ, with many of the scholars I've cited and will cite, historian Carolyn Dinshaw discusses, quote, the possibility of touching across time, collapsing time through affective contact between marginalized people now and then, and suggests, quote, that with such queer historical touches, we could form communities across time. In Colin's two unpublished novels and his final tapes, which date from the mid to late 90s, he explicitly grappled with these ideas. In videos like Rendezvous, Déjà Vu, Disheveled Destiny, and Que Sera Sera, he returned to the personas he created in the 70s, like the woman from Malibu, whether through found footage or through performing them again, and invented new narratives for them. In his first novel, The Lizard's Bite, there's a character who's given eternal life after finding Caravaggio's diaries, and the painter continues to make mischief hundreds of years later among a group of his fans. The second novel, Deadly Destiny, as I mentioned, deals with reincarnation and the ripples in the present day caused by a queer medieval poet and monk on the life of a scholar studying him in the present. Incidentally, in researching this paper, I came across a fascinating formulation by Elizabeth Freeman of drag as a kind of reincarnation, a historical slippage. Quote, "We might think of it as a non-narrative history written with the body, in which the performer channels another body, making this body available to a context unforeseen in its bearer's lived historical moment." And I wanted to also cite Emily, the many voices that live in one historical body. So beyond Colin's self-reflexive final works, I'm more generally interested in his legacy as a way of retracing, as video artist and academic Win Tan Hong puts it, quote, "a young person's secretive and circuitous roots to queer culture through music, art, literature, popular culture, and revisiting the various scenes of queer pedagogy, not only in the classroom and library, but also in the park, street, bar, basement, kitchen, chat room, bedroom. There's a long history of what scholar Michael Moon calls scenes of initiation, where queer and proto-queer children are transformed by cultural objects and figures from the past that seem to speak through time, and they go on to imitate them in their own lives and artistic practices." I just want to give a few examples because I think this is quite key to queer cultural production. So why don't we start with the picture of Dorian Gray, where Oscar Wilde writes, quote, "There were times when it appeared to Dorian Gray that the whole of history was merely the record of his own life, not as he had lived it in act and circumstance, but as his imagination had created it for him, as it had been in his brain and in his passions. He felt that he had known them all, those strange, terrible figures that had passed across the stage of the world and made sin so marvelous and evil so full of subtlety. It seemed to him that in some mysterious way their lives had been his own." This text is a key one in Todd Haynes' 1998 film Velvet Goldmine, which imagines Oscar Wilde as an alien from another planet who is the origin figure for the dandy glam rockers that would sashay in his footsteps 100 years later. Haynes symbolizes Wilde in a precious object, an emerald that acts as a queer form of parentage. Rather than inheriting fabulousness from biological lineage, this gem is passed from dandy to dandy, glam rocker to glam rocker over the ages. And in the film, glam rocker Brian Slade is the touchstone for young fan Arthur Stewart's queer feelings, a model and a means of understanding his own oblique position in the world. And there's a very cathartic moment where we watch Arthur watching Brian come out of the closet as bisexual in a press conference on television. And Arthur is watching this in his parents' living room and imagines himself jumping up and down in front of the TV yelling, "That's me, that's me." And the TV seems to be a very privileged site for these sort of initiation moments for a certain generation, with performance scholar Jose Esteban Munoz recalling the formative experience of seeing Truman Capote on a trashy late-night talk show and being mesmerized with a mix of terror and pleasure at his bitchy, swishy spectacle. So I believe that the ongoing relevance and circulation of Colin's identity and his work is a queer artistic legacy that exceeds the heterosexual kinship reproductive model, a touch across time and generations that is arguably the lifeblood of queer cultural production, particularly in the age of our supposed normalization and liberation. So on the one hand, you have Colin Campbell himself as a figure who had a huge influence on many hundreds of students as a professor at the University of Toronto, but this mentorship role went beyond the bounds of the institution and was really a part of his day-to-day life. And then you have the continued circulation of Colin's work itself, which by design are very much open texts. They absorbed and reworked material taken from his everyday life, shared with friends in a community. There's no narrative closure, concern for distinctions between truth and fiction, and they're very much open-ended, inconclusive, and provisional. And material and themes are reworked throughout his career. And the Culver City Limits that we saw as part of a series, generally called the Woman from Malibu series, that begins where she's witnessing her husband fall off a glacier. So the reference to the glacier and the blood in the middle section, there's this constant, this narrative, continues throughout the work. So there's also a whole set of tapes from the 1980s, such as White Money and The Woman Who Went Too Far, There's much about their own process of formation and about how narratives are constructed as they are narratives in themselves. The work is also highly verbal, conversational, and discursive, and this flow of talk continues after death. Gossip takes on a life of its own once it's left a mouth and found an ear. Because they're so intimate and chatty, these tapes give you the sense that you're being let in on a secret, that you're being initiated into a glamorous club, a social scene that lives longer than individual members do. And I've been interested to hear how much talk and speech and voice has come up today. And you know, the idea of a whispered art history, community of the mouth, silence equals death. And also talk is territorial, which I think could have been a subtitle for this talk. Finally, the characters are mythic. They may come from daily life, but they are supplemented by fantasy to become something bigger. Alter egos, beyond gender, beyond authorship, beyond lifespans, Collins or otherwise. As I say in my text, quote, now left bereft of bodies, but floating free in our collective consciousness. That's why they can keep talking even after they've passed away. For example, his persona of the woman from Malibu was cobbled together from Los Angeles Times headlines that Campbell absorbed. She is a state's worth of stories, and every woman who embodies the confusing and chaotic Southern California 70s as she retreats from reality into small details, facts, and figures. And then beyond the figure of Colin and his work, you have his continued mythology, kept alive by his friends, colleagues, and those he has inspired, with projects like the Colin Campbell Sessions video commissioning project, Mike Hulboom's 2006 experimental feature film portrait Fascination, and the restoration and distribution of his body of work by video art distributor V-Tape, which partly controls his estate and which he co-founded. And you also have the retrospectives like the one at the Oakville Galleries and Colin Campbell media works curated by Bruce Ferguson in the early 90s, which toured Canada, including a stop at the power plant. So Colin haunts us in a number of ways. He's a ghost, but what is so affecting, I think, is that he's only one of many. I would argue that the ghost has become a privileged figure in queer culture since the dawn of the AIDS pandemic, as I suggested at the beginning with my reference to the haunting quality of AIDS activist video. In the queer community, the AIDS pandemic has effectively eroded the boundaries between the living and the dead, demanding that we make room for ghosts, the ghosts of dead artists in particular. And so with AIDS, the phenomenon of queer cultural transmission and of artistic legacies being passed on that I've been discussing has become even more a kind of haunting. And I just want to reference A. Bronson here, who transformed his existence and his art practice after the deaths of his fellow General Idea members Felix Parts and Jorge Zontal, is now conducting queer seances with collaborator Peter Hobbs and many others that he calls Invocation of the Queer Spirits. Bronson states simply, we each participate in a queer community of the living and the dead. Jean Carla Musto, again, reflecting on Emily Royston's untitled 2001 photos in homage to David Wojnarowicz's 1978 series Rainbow in New York, offers a strikingly similar anecdote to her comments on watching the AIDS activist footage in Fast Trip Long Drop, though in this case, it's hopeful instead of despairing. She claims that Royston's photos, quote, evoke the eerie experience I sometimes have on the streets of New York. I'll see a friend whom I haven't seen in years. As I approach to say hi, I realize they died of AIDS years ago, and the person passing by merely bears a resemblance. A momentary lapse, a suspension of disbelief, a desire to recall a friend's presence back into the everyday tableau of the New York streets. Royston's work reminds me of these radiant spaces, places of suture and reclamation where you can transport the spirit of our heroes to the present drama of our lives, a drama they somehow inspire anyway. And we just have, that's one of Wojnarowicz's of Rainbow, and that's one of Royston's of Wojnarowicz. And let me back up. Royston herself talks about, quote, a queer relationship to history in the movement between time and space. I know that even in my community now, we live in a mythical space, spinning histories wide, looking far, and queering all that we can, mythical as well in the expansive web of our relations and commitments. I think especially from the ravaging of our communities through AIDS and the straight world we live in, queers are less willing to forego our icons and the lessons from the past. We've had the opportunity to call our history, and in that action, we perform our future. Another example, in Sadie Benning's 2006 two-screen animation play Pause, which also showed the power plant, the beating heart of an economically and existentially depressed war on terror era American Midwest city is a polymorphously perverse hangout called the Z-Bar, modeled on the Milwaukee gay bars Benning hung out in her youth. The Z-Bar evokes a community devastated by AIDS from the artist's youth, who seem to offer us lessons in kinship and how to negotiate between despair and hope, having lived through hell themselves. Writing about the work of Felix Gonzalez Torres, meanwhile, Emily Boone Hagenmeyer suggests that, quote, the radical potential of melancholia lies in the interpretation not of what is lost, but instead of what remains. This conception of an enduring, active social relationship between the surviving and the lost challenges assumptions about the temporal and spatial boundaries between living and dead. And I would like to trace the transformation of Gonzalez Torres's candy spill, untitled USA Today, into an artwork by the Texas artist Dario Robleto entitled I Miss Everyone Who Has Ever Gone Away, which was recently on view at the power plant in the exhibition Not Quite How I Remember It. So, and here we have the Felix Gonzalez Torres and the Robleto. So Robleto's I Miss Everyone Who Has Ever Gone Away is essentially a mobile made of folded airplanes constructed from candy wrappers taken from Gonzalez Torres's untitled USA Today. This sparks curator Helena Reckitt to ask, can the present harbor the past as the ground shelters a dormant seed? Can a living artist collaborate with a dead one? The piece fulfills Gonzalez Torres's conviction that art's resonance extends beyond the art object to the associations, recollections, and new works that it generates, an expanded concept of authorship that values collectivity and gift economies above private ownership. Robleto himself inquires, can a creative gesture begun by one artist be passed like a baton through the years to be continued or completed by another artist in another time so that it never has to end? Incidentally, I can't help but see Gonzalez Torres's candy spills, where patrons are invited to take away the candies and consume them, as a metaphor for the way Collins and other images and influence travel virally through the broader culture, the way certain artists seem to disperse into the atmosphere and become the very air we breathe. I'd also like to bring up Catherine Opie's large format Polaroid in memory, Lee Bowery, 2000, from her series with Ron Athey. In her recent retrospective at the Guggenheim in New York, this image's provenance on the wall label read, quote, Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, gift of Gary Hefferman, Chip Tom, and Michael W. Rabkin, C. Bradford Smith, and Donald L. Davis, in honor of the birth of Oliver Hill Opie, and gift in memory of John S. Barron. And seeing the images of Opie's son Oliver elsewhere in the exhibition, in a tutu, and being breastfed by Opie, I found this litany of names to be an incredibly emotional testament to a work of art's mantling of the queer dead, living, and newly born. And of course, the image of Bowery is of an absence, an empty throne with no queen on it, a gown that is now missing a body to fill it. So just to wrap up, I'd like to bring us back to one of Colin's most important collaborative relationships, and that's to his dear friend, filmmaker and video artist John Grayson, whose work is populated by legions of ghosts of history's dead queers. To give just one example, his canonical 1993 feature film Zero Patience follows Sir Richard Francis Burton, somehow alive and well and working in a Toronto Natural History Museum, where he hopes to develop an exhibit around Patient Zero, the mythic promiscuous flight attendant who reputedly single-handedly introduced AIDS to North America. The ghost of Zero returns, and Burton, perhaps because he should be dead himself, is the only one who can see him. Steeped in camp and artifice, one could argue that Grayson's modus operandi is anachronism, as he collides together seemingly conflicting historical figures, styles, and forms in a single work. The figure, I guess I should bring this up. When I think about Colin's use of direct address and all these characters who are speaking directly to you in their monologues, I have to mention John Grayson's resurrection of Bertolt Brecht as a catfish who debates the strategies of cinematic realism with a human George Lukács in his filmmaking of Monsters. So the figure of the ghost is a literal manifestation of the anachronism, for they are a person who refuses to dematerialize after their time is through. Neither quite dead nor fully alive, they evidence open wounds, unfinished business, moving freely between the past and the present, confronting us against our will. In Grayson's work, if a dead queer historical figure could shed light on a contemporary dilemma, then it is our responsibility to bring them back to life and squeeze some wit and wisdom from them. So I'd like to think that Colin's ghost will continue to haunt us as long as we live in a time and place that desperately needs his wryly profound lessons in desire, in how to perform the self, and in how to glamorously navigate a hostile world. Thank you.
Well, maybe we should thank Carlos Boswelder for not being able to make it. I want to throw things open soon, and we'll probably stray a little bit into our coffee break. But maybe just to start with one question, I suppose to sort of quote something Louis said, in the absence of history, people turn to myth, and there was a lot of talk in both of your presentations about icons, pioneers, with this sort of idea of celebrity and glamour. I suppose my question is, how do we do this without falling into just kind of replicating star systems, which we know very well in the art world? And how do we do this in some way that is more, I don't know, critical or self-conscious? And yeah, that's my kickoff question.
Good one.
Okay. Go on then.
Yeah, I mean, you gave us a list of icons, heroes, celebrities, and something else.
Pioneers.
Pioneers. Oh, that's what it was. I think those have to be pulled apart. Like, I think celebrities are the undoing of icons. Like, if we're talking about it like this, and that's what I try to do in my talk. In a way, say that artwork is the enemy of network. And yet, it's sort of the form that network must take in order to reproduce itself beyond itself, right? And so in a way, like these bad things, like kind of celebrity culture and artistic culture in general, which I think depends on that, or at least on authorship, let's say, or kind of naming a practice. And objectifying a practice. Those are bad things to the extent that they obscure, or worse, kind of negate the milieu or the culture, the network culture that they come from. And yet I think in that very process, they also are able to do something with which network culture, maybe or maybe not, I'd like to leave this open, is not able to do, and that is to reproduce itself. You know, these are things that Emily was talking about and that John was talking about, like the idea, especially kind of in a queer context, this is like an explicit issue, is how does experience get transmitted kind of beyond the limits of your body, but also the limits of your immediate relationships. Yeah, so I'm not answering your question in the sense of how to avoid it, but I guess I try to highlight that celebrity or artwork or culture by media is in a way the enemy, but it's also in a way it's the only tool we have for establishing publicness, which is to say kind of an otherness outside of our own circles, right? Whether that's the only kind of cultural form that we can imagine, I would very much like to leave that open. But I do believe it's the culture we have.
Okay. Yeah. John, any thoughts?
I think it's important to sort of give credit where credit is due. And when there are figures who seem to be like a touchstone for an entire network or for an entire community and sort of where they're not just a figure, but they represent a multiplicity of people, and a sort of their work was always open to the broader social world. I think that they sort of go beyond just being like an individual, like the cult of personality, or that worshiping a certain individual. And I think I agree with Louis that there's sort of the media transmission, that's often the source of extremely transformative sort of moments that that you wouldn't have without that media culture.
I also, I mean, just in listening to your talk, John, you called it "I didn't know him." Mm-hmm. I didn't know him, and this idea that you come to know a figure through a kind of fixation on them, mm-hmm. that there is something about an individual figure, perhaps one, and maybe necessarily one that you will never meet, that becomes a sort of point of identification that gives you access to a time that you didn't see, and that it's this person becomes some kind of important conduit.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm interested in Colin Campbell, but also lots of other figures as like sort of an enabling force and a productive force that sort of goes beyond the figure to inspiring creativity and production in others.
I'm sure there are some questions out there who would like to ask something or make some kind of comment or response. Or maybe while you're thinking of your questions, I mean, you've talked about this and you have really answered this, but I'm still really interested in why is your generation, and you're not really from the same generation, but why are artists, creative folk so interested right now in...
Yeah, personally, I think it's intrinsic to the practice of making art is to deal with history, to kind of construct trajectories and kind of do this action that Emily talked about of kind of doing this, right? I think it's intrinsic to the activity of art. I think it's worth asking sort of what forms is that intrinsic quality taking sort of today or within a generation. You know, we've been talking about reenactments and like why is reenactment a kind of like explicit, in a way everything's a reenactment, but why the theatricality of reenactment has become such an important thing. And also within that, can we make distinctions within that practice of different kinds of Simon yesterday in his talk talked about a mannerist reenactment in which it's a kind of play of stylistics so that you kind of in the right, you know, brand of jacket to reenact this thing. And there's a kind of publicness that's built out of those things where we kind of recognize, there's a delight in recognizing the appropriateness of the stylistic, the play of styles. So we can kind of recognize and see, oh yeah, that's really clever, that's really well done. Or even giggle like, oh my God, that was so naughty to do it like that. But I do believe there's a different kind of reenactment that's not mannerist in that sense. And I don't know what word I would give it or what kind of name I would give it. I'm still kind of processing it. I guess it has to do with, I think, wearing a mask, I think. You know, like putting it on as your own face. Or what I said earlier about language or art as a kind of invitation, as an invitation to use somebody else's words as your own. You know, I think the kind of reenactment that allows you to speak from your own, the identity that you're constructing, for me, that's a different kind of reenactment and not one based on a kind of facility, like look at how well able I am in manipulating the codes, but in developing a kind of ownership, a kind of me, this is my face. Even though I know it's not my face and you know it's not my face, it's allowing me to kind of have a presence or have a kind of publicness with somebody else. Yeah.
I was thinking about Simon's talk as well, and you know, I was struck by what he said about instead of having a sort of student protest, you know, we'll reenact a scene from the Kent State or whatever, and I thought, gosh, that does sound really feeble. But I thought, what for generations who haven't been in a time where there has been a lot of public, you know, civil, it's almost like they're going through a form of mentorship. It's like, well, how do I learn this? I'm going to literally like enact something that happened before me, not as a, but really as